The candles had barely been lit when the whispering began, and Eleanor Whitmore already knew it was about her. She stood near the edge of the ballroom, a glass of untouched punch in her hand, watching her youngest sister Beatrice glow under the attention of every eye in the room. It was Beatrice's betrothal ball, and rightly so. She had captured the heart of a viscount within a single season, just as Charlotte had captured an earl the year before, and Margaret a baron the year before that. 3 sisters, 3 brilliant matches. And then there was Eleanor, 9 and 20, still unmarried, still standing at the edges of rooms while the world celebrated everyone but her. She had stopped minding it, or told herself she had. There was a particular kind of peace that came from being invisible. No one expected anything from a woman that Tun had already decided was destined to be alone. No one watched her missteps, because no one watched her at all. That was, until the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and a hush spread across the room like water finding the lowest point. Nathaniel Ashworth, Duke of Camden, entered without fanfare, though fanfare followed him regardless. He was the wealthiest unmarried man in England, and the most sought after, and the most famously unavailable. He had refused every match his own mother had arranged. He had ended a courtship publicly 2 seasons ago without explanation, and society had never forgiven him for the mystery of it, nor stopped trying to solve it. Eleanor watched him the way she watched everyone at these events, from a careful distance, expecting nothing. She had learned long ago that dukes did not notice women like her. She was not cruel enough to be memorable, nor beautiful enough to be dangerous. She was simply there, the eldest, the overlooked one, the sister who came before the sisters who mattered. So when the Duke of Camden crossed the entire length of the ballroom, past countesses angling for his attention and mothers pushing their daughters into his path, and stopped directly in front of her, Eleanor assumed, for one full second, that he had mistaken her for someone else. "You are the only person in this room who has not looked at me once," he said. Eleanor blinked. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not realize looking at you was required." A ripple of shocked laughter came from a cluster of women nearby, quickly smothered behind fans. Eleanor felt her face warm, certain she had just committed some unforgivable breach of manners, but the Duke did not look offended. He looked, if anything, entertained. "It is not required," he said. "It is simply unusual. Most people in this room have looked at nothing else since I arrived. Then perhaps they have better manners than I do. Or perhaps you simply do not care what I think of you." Eleanor considered lying. It would have been easier, safer, to offer some practiced flattery, and let him move on to more interesting company. But something about the directness of his gaze made her tired of pretending. "I have spent a decade in ballrooms, very much like this one, Your Grace, watching my sisters be admired. I have found that caring what powerful men think of me rarely changes my circumstances." "And what are your circumstances?" "I am the eldest Whitmore daughter," she said simply, "unmarried, overlooked. Tonight I am celebrating my youngest sister's betrothal, which makes 4 sisters and only 3 engagements, if you are counting." "I am not counting," he said. "I find arithmetic tedious at parties." Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. It was small, and it surprised her, because she could not remember the last time a conversation at one of these events had earned an honest smile from her rather than a polite one. "You find something amusing," the Duke observed. "I find it amusing that the most talked-about man in London has chosen to spend his time discussing arithmetic with the least talked-about woman in it." "Perhaps I am tired of being talked about," he said. "There is a particular exhaustion in being watched constantly, Miss Whitmore. Everyone in this room has an opinion of me they have never bothered to test against the truth. You, at least, have not decided anything about me yet." "Give me time," Eleanor said. "I am sure I will find fault with you eventually. I look forward to it." She had expected him to move on then, to have satisfied whatever curiosity had drawn him across the room, and return to the company that suited a duke. Instead, he remained beside her for the better part of an hour, asking questions no one else had ever asked her. What she read, what she thought of the new railways being built outside London, whether she believed her sister's matches had made them happy, or merely secure. She found herself answering honestly, forgetting, for long stretches, that she was speaking to one of the most powerful men in England, rather than simply a man who seemed genuinely curious about her answers. It was Beatrice who finally interrupted them, breathless and flushed with the excitement of her own engagement, pulling Eleanor aside under the pretense of introducing her to the Viscount's family. But Eleanor caught the look Beatrice gave her as they walked away, a look somewhere between confusion and concern, as though she could not understand why the Duke of Camden had spent an hour speaking to her forgotten eldest sister, rather than anyone else in the room. Eleanor could not entirely understand it either. She told herself, as she was introduced to a string of relatives whose names she would not remember by morning, that it meant nothing. Dukes were permitted their curiosities. He had likely grown bored of being fawned over and sought out the one woman who would not fawn, purely for the novelty of it. By tomorrow he would have forgotten her name entirely, and she would return to the comfortable invisibility she had built for herself over a decade of seasons. But then, as the orchestra began the next set, she felt a presence beside her again, and turned to find the Duke had followed. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and there was something almost formal in the way he said it, as though he had rehearsed the request. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance?" The room did not go silent, not exactly. But Eleanor felt every eye that had been politely ignoring her all evening suddenly turn in her direction. She saw her mother, across the room, go still with a glass of wine halfway to her lips. She saw Charlotte's husband lean toward his wife and whisper something behind his hand. She saw the flicker of surprise cross even Beatrice's face, quickly replaced by something warmer. For one long moment, Eleanor simply stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to dance with me," she said, not quite a question. "I believe that is generally what is meant by the request. There are a great many women in this room who would be thrilled to dance with you, Your Grace. Younger women. Prettier women. Women who have not spent the last decade being told they are the sister no one chose." Something shifted in his expression then, something that looked almost like anger, though not directed at her. "I did not ask any of those women," he said. "I asked you." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, some old and carefully guarded wall she had built brick by brick over years of being the one left standing at the edges of rooms. She did not know this man. She did not know what he wanted, or why he had chosen tonight, of all nights, to notice her. But she found that she wanted, very badly, to say yes. "Then I accept," she said. He offered his arm, and she took it, and as they walked toward the center of the floor, she was aware of every gaze in the room following them, aware of the whispers already beginning to spread like fire through dry grass. By morning, all of London would be asking the same question she was asking herself. Why had the Duke of Camden chosen the overlooked eldest Whitmore daughter when he could have chosen anyone at all? The music began, and Nathaniel Ashworth took her hand, and for the first time in 10 years of seasons, Eleanor Whitmore did not feel invisible. She felt seen. And somewhere across the ballroom, a woman in deep green silk watched the two of them with narrowed eyes, her fan snapping shut with a sound sharp enough to cut through the music. Lady Cordelia Vane had spent 2 seasons positioning herself to become the next Duchess of Camden, and she had no intention of watching that future slip away to a woman society had already forgotten. The dance ended. The whispers did not. By the time Eleanor returned home that night, her mother was waiting in the hallway, an expression on her face that Eleanor had never seen directed at her before. Not disappointment, not resignation, something that looked, unmistakably, like interest. "The Duke of Camden," her mother said slowly, as though testing the words. "Danced with you, twice, I am told, though I could hardly believe the first report." "It was only conversation, mother, and one dance. Nothing involving that man is only anything," her mother said. "Eleanor, do you understand what this could mean?" Eleanor did not answer, because she did not fully understand it herself. She only knew that for the first time since she had entered society 10 years ago, she had walked into a ballroom as the overlooked sister, and walked out of it as someone the entire ton could not stop discussing. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, lying awake long after the house had gone quiet, she felt only a quiet, unfamiliar fear. She had spent a decade building a life around being invisible, and invisibility, whatever its costs, had also been a kind of safety. Now the most powerful duke in England had looked directly at her, and she had no idea what it would cost her to be seen. 3 streets away, in a townhouse draped in mourning colors she had never quite abandoned, Lady Cordelia Vane sat before her mirror, removing her jewels one by one with hands that were not quite steady. She had watched the Duke of Camden for 2 years. She had learned his habits, his preferences, the particular way he avoided women who wanted his title more than his company. She had built herself into exactly the kind of woman she believed he wanted, patient, composed, never desperate. And in one evening, a plain, overlooked spinster with a sharp tongue and no dowry worth mentioning had undone 2 years of careful work with nothing more than a single honest conversation. Cordelia set down her earrings with deliberate care, and in the mirror, her reflection was calm even as something cold and determined settled behind her eyes. She would not lose the Duke of Camden to Eleanor Whitmore. Whatever it took, she would make certain of that. News in London traveled faster than any carriage, and by the following afternoon, every drawing room in Mayfair was repeating the same story with growing embellishment. The Duke of Camden had danced with Eleanor Whitmore, twice. He had spoken to no one else for the better part of an hour. He had, according to one particularly inventive account, requested her hand in marriage before the night was through, though that particular rumor had no truth in it at all. Eleanor sat in the morning room, trying to focus on her embroidery while her mother read aloud from a stack of calling cards that had arrived before breakfast had even been cleared away. "Lady Pembroke wishes to call this afternoon," her mother said, holding up another card as though it were a trophy. "And Mrs. Ashford, and Lady Grantham, who has not spoken a single word to this family in 3 years." "They are not calling on me, Mother," Eleanor said. "They are calling on the possibility of a duke. Does it matter why they call, if they call at all?" Eleanor set down her needle. It did matter, though she was not certain how to explain that to a mother who had spent a decade treating her as an afterthought and was now treating her as the family's greatest asset, purely because a powerful man had shown her a moment's attention. The door opened, and Charlotte entered without waiting to be announced, her expression bright with barely contained excitement. She had married well the year before, an earl with a comfortable fortune, and she had never once, in Eleanor's memory, sought her out simply for the pleasure of conversation. "Is it true?" Charlotte asked, settling onto the settee beside their mother. "The whole of London is speaking of nothing else." "We danced," Eleanor said. "That is the entirety of what happened." "That is not what I heard. I heard he stood beside you for an hour before he even asked." "You make it sound more significant than it was." "Eleanor," Charlotte's voice softened, and for a moment, something like genuine warmth passed between them, a rare thing after years of quiet distance. "The Duke of Camden does not stand beside anyone for an hour. He does not dance twice with anyone. Whatever this was, it was not nothing." Before Eleanor could answer, the youngest sister, Beatrice, appeared in the doorway, still glowing from her own betrothal, though her expression now carried a note of something more complicated. She crossed the room and sat beside Eleanor, taking her hand. "I am happy for you," Beatrice said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Truly I am. I only wonder if you are prepared for what this attention will bring. It is not always kind being watched." Eleanor squeezed her sister's hand, grateful for the honesty even as she noticed Margaret, the second eldest, standing silently near the window, her expression unreadable. Margaret had married a baron 2 seasons ago, a match everyone considered respectable if not spectacular, and she had spent the years since carefully positioning herself as the most sensible of the sisters. She said nothing now, only watched Eleanor with an expression that did not match the warmth in the rest of the room. The calling cards continued through the afternoon, and Eleanor endured a parade of women who had never once sought her company, all of them fishing delicately for details about the Duke, about what he had said, about whether an understanding had been reached. She answered honestly each time that nothing had been decided, that it had been only conversation and dancing, but she could see in their faces that none of them believed her. It was nearly evening when the Duke himself called, and the entire household seemed to hold its breath at the sound of his carriage in the street. Nathaniel Ashworth was shown into the drawing room with a formality that made Eleanor's mother nearly trip over her own skirts in her haste to greet him properly. He bowed over her mother's hand, greeted her father with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to such visits, and then turned his attention to Eleanor with a directness that made the rest of the room feel suddenly very far away. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I hoped I might persuade you to walk in the garden, if your mother permits it." Eleanor's mother permitted it with such enthusiasm that Eleanor nearly laughed. Within minutes, she found herself walking beside the Duke along the narrow garden path behind the townhouse, out of earshot of the household, though certainly not out of sight of the windows, where she could feel her mother and sisters watching from behind the curtains. "You did not have to call," Eleanor said, once they were far enough from the house. "The entire ton is already speaking of little else. You have given them more than enough to discuss." "I did not call for the ton," he said. "I called because I found, this morning, that I wished to continue our conversation from last night, and I could think of no reasonable excuse to wait a full week to do so. Most gentlemen wait a proper interval before calling. It is considered good form. I have never been particularly interested in good form," he said. "I find it wastes time better spent on honesty." Eleanor glanced sideways at him, studying his profile in the fading afternoon light. "You are unusual, for a duke." "I have been told that before, though rarely as a compliment. I meant it as one." He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch, though she could not have said why. Miss Whitmore, I will be direct with you, since directness seems to be the only language we speak comfortably together. I made inquiries about you before I ever approached you last night. Eleanor stopped walking. Inquiries? I asked a mutual acquaintance about the eldest Whitmore daughter, whom I had noticed at several events over the past 2 seasons, always at the edges of rooms, always overlooked in favor of her sisters. I wanted to know why a woman who was clearly intelligent, clearly capable, had spent a decade being treated as though she did not matter. And what did you learn? That you were considered plain by comparison to your sisters, and too sharp-tongued to be fashionable, and that most families had quietly given up hope of a match for you years ago. He said it without cruelty, simply as fact, and somehow that made it easier to hear than if he had softened it. I also learned that you had refused 2 offers of marriage in the past 5 years, both from men considered perfectly respectable matches. Eleanor felt her face warm. You have been thorough. I wanted to understand why a woman with 2 respectable offers behind her remained unmarried, when marriage was clearly available to her if she wished it. And what conclusion did you reach? That you were waiting for something you had not yet found, or someone. He held her gaze steadily. I confess, Miss Whitmore, that I have grown tired of women who perform for my title rather than speak to me as a man. I have been jilted once, humiliated publicly for a woman who chose a wealthier prospect over my affection, and I have spent every season since watching every woman who approaches me with the same suspicion. You did not perform for me last night. You did not flatter me, or soften your opinions to please me. I found that I could not stop thinking of it. Eleanor did not know how to answer him. No one had ever spoken to her with such unguarded honesty, and she found herself wanting to match it, even as some careful, protective part of her urged caution. I do not know what you want from me, she said finally. Neither do I, entirely, he admitted. I only know that I wish to continue knowing you, if you will permit it, without either of us pretending to be something we are not for the sake of society's approval. Before Eleanor could respond, a voice called from the garden gate, sharp and bright with false warmth. Your Grace, what a pleasant surprise, finding you here. Eleanor turned to see a woman approaching along the path, dressed in deep green, her smile polished to perfection. She recognized her vaguely from the ball the night before, though she could not recall her name. Lady Vane, Nathaniel said, and Eleanor noted the careful neutrality in his voice. I did not realize you were acquainted with the Whitmore family. Only slightly, Cordelia said, her gaze sliding over Eleanor with an assessment so brief and so sharp that Eleanor felt it like a blade. I was passing, and saw your carriage. I simply wished to pay my respects to Miss Whitmore, given the sudden interest surrounding her. How kind, Eleanor said carefully. Cordelia's smile did not waver. It must be quite overwhelming, Miss Whitmore, to find oneself suddenly at the center of so much attention, after so many quiet years. I do hope you are prepared for the scrutiny that follows a man of the Duke's position. Not everyone survives it gracefully. The words were polite on their surface, but Eleanor heard the threat beneath them clearly enough, and she saw, from the flicker in Nathaniel's expression, that he heard it too. I find Miss Whitmore remarkably well prepared for scrutiny, Nathaniel said evenly. She has survived a decade of it already, largely unnoticed by those who ought to have paid better attention. Cordelia's smile finally faltered, just slightly, before she recovered it. Of course. Well, I shall leave you both to your walk. I only hope, Miss Whitmore, that whatever attention you receive proves worth its cost. She departed with the same practiced grace with which she had arrived, but Eleanor felt the chill of the encounter linger long after Cordelia had disappeared through the garden gate. You should be careful of her, Nathaniel said quietly, once they were alone again. Who is she? Lady Cordelia Vane, a widow of considerable ambition, who has made her interest in becoming Duchess of Camden known to nearly everyone in London except myself, until recently. He shook his head. I never encouraged her. I want you to understand that clearly. You do not owe me an explanation. Perhaps not, but I would rather you hear the truth from me than allow her to shape your understanding of it. He paused, his expression turning serious. She does not lose gracefully, Miss Whitmore. I would ask that you be cautious in the days ahead. Eleanor nodded slowly, though a small, cold unease had settled in her chest that she could not quite shake. She thought of the sharpness in Cordelia's eyes, the barely concealed venom beneath her polished words, and understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever had begun between herself and the Duke of Camden would not go uncontested. They finished their walk in quieter conversation, and by the time Nathaniel took his leave, promising to call again within the week, Eleanor found herself both hopeful and unsettled in equal measure. Hopeful, because for the first time in years, a man had looked at her and seen something worth pursuing. Unsettled, because she understood now that Lady Cordelia Vane would not simply step aside and allow it to happen. That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, a note arrived by messenger, unsigned, written in a careful, deliberate hand. She read it twice before the meaning fully settled into her chest like a stone. You are not the first woman he has shown interest in, and you will not be the last to discover that his attention is far less permanent than it appears. Enjoy it while it lasts, Miss Whitmore. It will not. Eleanor folded the note carefully and set it aside, her hands steadier than she felt. She did not know for certain who had sent it, though she suspected, and she understood, with a clarity that settled deep and cold in her chest, that the coming weeks would test her in ways she had not yet begun to imagine. The unsigned note haunted Eleanor for 3 days before she finally showed it to Nathaniel, unfolding it across the small table between them in the quiet corner of her family's garden where they had taken to meeting each afternoon. He read it once, his jaw tightening visibly, then read it again more slowly. This is her handwriting. I would recognize it anywhere, though she has disguised it poorly. You cannot be certain. I am certain enough. He set the note down with deliberate care, as though controlling the urge to crumple it. I am sorry, Eleanor. I did not think she would resort to something so direct so quickly. It was the first time he had used her given name, and despite the tension of the moment, Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest at the sound of it. You need not apologize for another woman's actions. Perhaps not, but I brought this into your life by pursuing you so openly. I underestimated how far Cordelia would go to prevent it. Over the following weeks, what had begun as a quiet, private courtship became something impossible to hide. Nathaniel called on Eleanor several times each week, always with perfect propriety, always in the company of a chaperone, and yet the frequency of his visits alone was enough to fuel endless speculation. Invitations that had never once included Eleanor's name now arrived addressed specifically to her. Hostesses who had spent a decade seating her at the least desirable end of every dinner table now competed for the honor of hosting her. Eleanor found the sudden attention almost dizzying, and she came to understand, slowly, painfully, just how much of her worth society had always measured by her proximity to powerful men, rather than anything true about her own character. It is strange, she told Nathaniel one afternoon, as they walked along the edge of a small lake on his estate, having been invited, with proper chaperonage, to view his gardens. I am the same woman I was 2 months ago. I have not changed. And yet everyone treats me as though I have become someone entirely different. You have not changed, Nathaniel agreed. Society's perception of your worth has changed, because I have shown interest in you. That says a great deal about society, and very little about you. It is exhausting, being suddenly visible after so many years of being overlooked. Do you wish you were invisible again? Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. No, I do not think I do, but I wish visibility came without quite so much scrutiny attached. He reached for her hand then, a small gesture, careful and deliberate, and she let him take it, feeling the warmth of his fingers against hers. I would spare you the scrutiny if I could. I cannot, but I can promise you that whatever comes, I do not intend to be discouraged by it. It was during this conversation that Nathaniel first spoke to her more fully of his past, of the betrothal in his youth that had shaped so much of his caution toward women in society. He had been 23, he told her, newly come into a portion of his inheritance, betrothed to a young woman he had believed loved him. 2 weeks before their wedding, she had broken the engagement publicly, in favor of a marquis with a fortune considerably larger than his own at the time, before he had inherited the full dukedom. The humiliation was not simply private, he said, his voice carefully controlled, though Eleanor could hear the old wound beneath it. It was public. Every paper in London reported it. Every drawing room discussed it for a full season. I became, for a time, an object of pity, which I found considerably worse than being an object of ambition. I am sorry, Eleanor said softly. It taught me to be wary, he continued. Every woman who has approached me since has seemed, to some degree, to be performing interest in me rather than expressing it honestly. I stopped trusting my own judgment of sincerity, because I had judged it so badly once before. He looked at her then, his expression open in a way she had not seen from him before. You are the first woman in 8 years who has not seemed to be performing anything at all. Perhaps I am simply a very good performer, Eleanor said, though she said it gently, testing whether he could still find humor in the subject. If you are, then you have deceived me thoroughly, and I find I do not mind. They spoke more that afternoon than they had in all their previous meetings combined, of childhoods and ambitions, of the particular loneliness of being the eldest child expected to set an example for younger siblings, of the private griefs neither of them had shared with anyone else in years. Eleanor found herself telling him things she had never told even her own sisters, about the quiet ache of watching her younger sisters be celebrated while she was consistently, gently, set aside. He listened without offering easy comfort, without dismissing her feelings, simply absorbing what she told him with a seriousness that made her feel, for the first time in a decade, genuinely understood. But even as their bond deepened, Cordelia Vane did not relent. Eleanor began to notice small, cutting remarks made in her presence at social gatherings, delivered with such polish that no one but Eleanor herself seemed to recognize them as deliberate cruelty. A comment about how remarkable it was that Eleanor had finally found favor, after so many quiet years. A pointed question about her dowry, asked in front of a room full of guests, designed to highlight how modest her prospects truly were, compared to what a duke might otherwise command. Eleanor bore each remark with as much grace as she could manage, refusing to give Cordelia the satisfaction of a visible reaction, though each one left a small, accumulating weight in her chest. It was her sister Margaret who finally voiced what Eleanor had begun to suspect on her own. "She will not stop with words," Margaret said one evening, finding Eleanor alone in the library after a particularly difficult dinner party. Margaret had always been the most reserved of the sisters, the least likely to offer unsolicited opinions, and Eleanor was surprised by the directness of her concern. Women like Lady Vane do not simply accept defeat gracefully. She has spent 2 years building toward becoming a duchess. She will not allow you to take that from her without a fight. What would you have me do? Withdraw, simply because she is unhappy? No, Margaret said, more gently than Eleanor expected. I would have you be careful, that is all. I know we have not always been close, Eleanor, and I know I have not always treated you as I should have. But I do not wish to see you hurt by a woman with nothing left to lose. It was the first genuine kindness Margaret had shown her in years, and Eleanor found herself unexpectedly moved by it, though she said nothing of the private note she had already received, not wishing to alarm her sister further. The following week, Nathaniel invited Eleanor and her family to a dinner at his townhouse, a formal introduction of sorts, and the first time his own household staff and closest associates would meet the woman society was now certain he intended to marry. Eleanor spent the afternoon preparing with more care than she had given any event in years, and arrived that evening feeling, for the first time, genuinely hopeful about the direction her life had taken. The dinner proceeded pleasantly enough, Nathaniel's household staff professional and warm, his closest friends curious but welcoming. It was only near the end of the evening, as the guests began to take their leave, that a footman approached Eleanor quietly, drawing her aside from the general conversation. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low, "forgive me for the intrusion, but I believe there is something you ought to know." "What is it?" The footman, a young man named Peter who had served the Ashworth household for several years, glanced around to ensure they were not overheard before continuing. "A letter arrived for His Grace this afternoon, delivered by private messenger. I did not read its contents, but I recognized the seal. It was Lady Vane's." Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "Do you know what it said?" "I do not, Miss Whitmore. Only that His Grace read it and grew very quiet afterward, and instructed that it not be discussed with anyone." Peter hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to his employer and some private sense of concern for Eleanor. "I only tell you because I have watched His Grace these past weeks, and he has seemed happier than I have seen him in years. I would not wish to see that undone by whatever mischief that woman intends." Eleanor thanked him quietly, her mind already racing through possibilities, none of them comforting. She sought out Nathaniel before her family departed, finding him briefly alone near the entrance hall. "Is everything well?" she asked carefully. "You seem distracted this evening." Near the end. Something flickered across his face, quickly smoothed away. "Nothing you need concern yourself with. A minor matter of business." Eleanor wanted to press further, but her mother was already calling for her from the carriage, and the moment passed. She rode home that night with an uneasy feeling she could not quite name, a sense that something was shifting beneath the surface of their careful, hopeful courtship, something she could not yet see clearly enough to name. She did not have to wait long to understand what it was. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the Whitmore household, addressed to Eleanor's father. Its contents devastating enough that by the time Eleanor was called into her father's study to explain herself, her hands were already trembling with a fear she did not yet fully understand. The letter, written in a hand that closely resembled her own, claimed that Eleanor had been secretly corresponding with a lower-ranked suitor, a man of modest means, and that her interest in the Duke of Camden was motivated purely by his fortune and title, her true affections engaged elsewhere. It included details specific enough, dates and locations plausible enough, that Eleanor's father regarded her with an expression of genuine, wounded confusion. "Tell me this is false," her father said quietly. "Tell me, and I will believe you." "It is entirely false," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I have never corresponded secretly with anyone. I do not even recognize the name mentioned in that letter." Her father studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "I believe you, but I fear, Eleanor, that this letter will not remain confined to this household. If it has already been sent to us, it has likely been sent elsewhere." Eleanor's stomach dropped. The Duke. "If he has received a similar letter," her father said grimly, "I fear we are about to discover exactly how much his affection for you can withstand." The summons came the following morning, brief and formal, requesting Eleanor's presence at the Ashworth townhouse at her earliest convenience. There was no warmth in the wording, none of the easy familiarity that had marked every note Nathaniel had sent her in recent weeks, and Eleanor understood, reading it over twice with hands that would not quite steady, that her father's fear had been justified. She arrived within the hour, shown into Nathaniel's private study rather than the drawing room where they usually received guests, and found him standing near the window, a folded letter held tightly in one hand. "You received one as well," she said, before he could speak. It was not a question. "I did." He turned to face her, and the openness she had grown accustomed to seeing in his expression had been replaced by something guarded, something that made her chest ache with the sudden distance between them. "It claims a great deal, Eleanor. Details I would not have expected a fabrication to include so precisely." "They are fabrications," Eleanor said. "Every word of it. I have never corresponded with the man named in that letter. I do not believe I have ever met him. The letter includes dates, locations, a description of correspondence spanning several months, beginning before we had even met." "Then it is a lie constructed with a great deal of care, Your Grace, because none of it happened." Something in her use of his title, formal and distant where she had grown accustomed to using his given name, seemed to land as sharply as she had intended it to. "I want to believe you," Nathaniel said, and his voice carried genuine strain. "But I have been deceived before, Eleanor, in ways that cost me a great deal. I do not know how to simply set that caution aside because you tell me to." "Then what would you have me do? Prove a negative? Prove that a correspondence I never engaged in does not exist?" Eleanor felt something hot and furious rising beneath the hurt. A decade of being doubted, dismissed, and overlooked, crystallizing suddenly into a refusal to be doubted now, not by a man she had trusted with truths she had shared with no one else. "I have spent 10 years being told, in 100 small ways, that I was not worth believing in. I had hoped you were different." "Eleanor." "No." She held up a hand, steadying herself against the tremor in her own voice. "I understand that you have been hurt before, and I am sorry for it, truly. But I will not spend the rest of whatever this is between us proving my honesty against forged letters and cruel rumors. If you cannot trust me now, at the very first challenge, then I do not see how you could ever trust me through whatever difficulties a marriage might bring." She left before he could respond, walking out through the entrance hall with her spine straight and her composure carefully held together, though it began to crumble the moment she was safely inside her family's carriage, tears finally slipping free as the horses pulled away. She did not know, as she rode home, that Nathaniel remained standing in his study for a long while after her departure, the forged letter still in his hand, his own certainty crumbling as he replayed her words. She had not begged. She had not wept in front of him, or pleaded for his trust. She had simply told him the truth and walked away when he failed to offer the faith she deserved, and something about the dignity of that departure struck him more forcefully than any protestation of innocence could have. He summoned Peter within the hour. "The letter that arrived for Miss Whitmore's father," Nathaniel said, "and the one that arrived here. I want to know how they came to be written, and by whom." Peter, who had already grown fond of Eleanor in the brief weeks he had observed her interactions with the household, did not hesitate. "I have wondered the same thing myself, Your Grace, since the evening of the dinner. Lady Vane's letter arrived that same afternoon. I did not think much of it at the time, but given what has followed, I confess I find the timing troubling." Nathaniel spent the following 2 days investigating quietly, comparing the handwriting in the forged letters against samples of Eleanor's own writing, borrowed discreetly from correspondence she had sent regarding social engagements. The differences were subtle, but present, small inconsistencies in the formation of certain letters that a careful eye could detect. He consulted a specialist in documents, a man occasionally employed by the courts to authenticate disputed papers, who confirmed within a day that the letters had not been written by the same hand as the genuine samples provided. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young housemaid in Cordelia Vane's employ, recently dismissed under circumstances she considered unjust, approached Peter with information she had been reluctant to share while still in Lady Vane's service. She had observed her former mistress practicing handwriting late at night, comparing it against a genuine letter she believed had been stolen or copied from Eleanor's own correspondence. She had thought little of it at the time, assuming it some private matter of Lady Vane's, until she heard whispers among the household staff of the scandal now consuming London society. Nathaniel also learned, through careful inquiry, that Margaret, Eleanor's second sister, had unwittingly provided Cordelia with information that had made the forgery more convincing. Margaret, still nursing old resentments toward her eldest sister despite her recent softening, had mentioned in passing conversation, at an event weeks earlier, small details about Eleanor's habits and correspondence style, never imagining the information would be used so maliciously. When Nathaniel gently confronted her with what he had learned, Margaret was horrified, insisting she had never intended harm, only having spoken carelessly to a woman she had not realized was gathering ammunition. Armed with the specialist's authentication, the housemaid's testimony, and Margaret's reluctant confirmation of how the details had been gathered, Nathaniel understood, with a growing sense of shame at his own earlier doubt, exactly what had been done to Eleanor, and by whom. He arrived at the Whitmore townhouse 2 days after their difficult confrontation, prepared to apologize as fully and as publicly as she required, only to be met at the door by a visibly distressed housekeeper. "Miss Whitmore is not here, Your Grace," the housekeeper said. "She left yesterday morning for the family's countryside estate. I do not believe she intends to return before the season concludes." Nathaniel felt something sharp and cold settle in his chest. "Did she say why?" "Only that she required distance from London, Your Grace." "I do not believe I need explain further." He stood on the doorstep for a long moment after the housekeeper had gone to fetch Eleanor's mother, understanding fully, for the first time, exactly how deeply his doubt had wounded her, and exactly how much he now needed to do to earn back what he had so carelessly risked. He returned to his townhouse and immediately began making arrangements, aware that whatever needed to be said to Eleanor now could not be said through letters or careful, formal notes. It would require him to go to her directly, to lay aside every trapping of his rank and simply be honest, in the way she had always insisted honesty required. Meanwhile, in the quiet countryside 3 days' journey from London, Eleanor stood at the window of her childhood bedroom, watching rain fall over fields she had not seen properly in years, and told herself firmly that she had done the right thing in leaving. She had spent a decade allowing others to define her worth, to decide when she mattered and when she did not, and she would not spend whatever years remained to her allowing a man's doubt, however understandable its origins, to define her again. And yet, lying awake that first night in the countryside, she found she could not entirely convince herself that leaving had been the whole of the answer. She missed him, more than she wanted to admit, more than pride alone could account for. She thought of his hand around hers beside the lake, of the careful honesty with which he had spoken of his own past hurts, of the particular way he had looked at her as though she were the only interesting person in any room they entered together. She did not yet know that he was already making plans to follow her, or that the truth of Cordelia Vane's deception was finally, fully, coming to light. She knew only that she had left London with her dignity intact, and that whatever came next would require her to decide, finally and for herself, what she truly wanted, independent of what society or scandal, or even love itself demanded of her. The rain had not let up in 3 days by the time Eleanor heard the sound of an unfamiliar carriage on the gravel drive below her window, and something in her chest tightened before she had even crossed the room to look. She recognized the crest on the carriage door immediately, and for a long moment she simply stood frozen at the glass, watching Nathaniel Ashworth step down into the rain without waiting for a footman to bring an umbrella, his coat already darkening with damp as he strode toward the house. By the time she reached the top of the stairs, her mother's voice was already carrying up from the entrance hall, flustered and delighted in equal measure, welcoming a duke into a household that had never once received such a visitor at its countryside doorstep. Eleanor descended slowly, her heart beating hard enough that she was certain it must be visible beneath her dress, and found Nathaniel standing in the entrance hall, rain still dripping from his hair, his expression carrying none of the guarded distance she had last seen in his study. You came all this way, she said when she trusted her voice enough to speak. I would have come further, he said. Eleanor, I need to speak with you. Alone, if your mother will permit it. Her mother, sensing correctly that this was not a conversation meant for an audience, ushered the rest of the household away with unusual efficiency, leaving Eleanor and Nathaniel alone in the small parlor off the entrance hall, rain still drumming steadily against the windows. I was wrong, Nathaniel said, before she could speak, before she could offer him any of the careful, distant courtesy she had planned to maintain. I was wrong to doubt you, even for a moment, and I have spent every hour since you left trying to understand how I allowed an old wound to make me doubt the one person who had never given me reason to. Nathaniel, please, let me finish. He crossed the room, stopping close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, the evidence of several sleepless nights. I discovered the truth. The letters were forged, both of them, by Cordelia Vane, with details gathered carelessly by your sister Margaret, who never intended the harm that came of it. I have a specialist's authentication proving the forgery, and testimony from a former member of Lady Vane's household confirming what was done. The man named in that letter does not exist, Eleanor. He was invented entirely. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, relief mingling with a lingering hurt that could not be entirely dissolved by vindication alone. I know I was innocent, Nathaniel. I did not need proof to know that. What I needed was for you to believe me without it. I know, he said quietly, and I failed you in that moment, exactly when you needed me not to. I have thought of little else since you left London. I have spent my adult life so guarded against being deceived again that I very nearly repeated the mistake that hurt me most, doubting a woman who had done nothing to deserve it, simply because doubt had once protected me before. And what has changed? I have realized that protecting myself from being hurt again is not the same as protecting what matters. I would rather risk being wrong and trust you than protect my own guarded heart at the cost of losing you entirely. He reached for her hand, and this time, though her instinct was still wary, she let him take it. I do not come here as a duke, Eleanor. I have left every trapping of that behind in London. I come only as a man who has made a grave mistake, and who hopes, more than he has hoped for anything in years, that you might find it in yourself to forgive him. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the hurt still fresh in her memory. You must understand something, she said finally. I spent 10 years being overlooked, being told in 100 quiet ways that I did not matter as much as the people around me. I will not spend the rest of my life in a marriage where my word is not trusted at the first difficulty. If we are to have any future together, I need to know that you will choose to believe in me, even when doubt would be easier. I choose it, Nathaniel said without hesitation. Not because it is easy, but because you have earned that trust 100 times over, in every honest conversation we have shared, in every moment you refused to perform for my benefit rather than simply be yourself. I was the one who failed to honor that. I do not intend to fail it again. Something in the steadiness of his voice, the absence of any performance or practiced charm, finally allowed the last of Eleanor's guarded distance to soften. I missed you, she admitted quietly. More than I wanted to. I missed you enough to travel 3 days through rain without stopping to change my coat, he said, and the small attempt at humor drew a genuine watery laugh from her, breaking the last of the tension between them. They spent the following days in careful, gentle reconciliation, walking the countryside paths despite the persistent rain, talking through everything that had happened with a thoroughness they had not allowed themselves before. Nathaniel told her every detail of his investigation, of Peter's loyalty, of the housemaid's brave testimony, of the specialist's authentication that had finally proven the forgery beyond doubt. It was during this time that Margaret arrived unexpectedly at the countryside estate, having traveled from London alone, without informing their mother of her intentions. Eleanor found her sister standing awkwardly in the entrance hall, clearly uncertain of her welcome. I came to apologize, Margaret said, before Eleanor could speak. Properly, and in person, rather than through some careless note. I did not intend for what I said to Cordelia Vane to be used as it was, but I understand now that my carelessness contributed to your suffering, and I am deeply sorry for it. Why did you speak to her at all? Eleanor asked, more curious than accusing. You have never been close with Lady Vane. Margaret's composure faltered slightly, revealing something rawer beneath her usual reserve. I was jealous of you, Eleanor. There, I have said it plainly. I watched you receive attention from the Duke of Camden, watched our family suddenly treat you as though you had always mattered as much as the rest of us, and some ungenerous part of me resented it. I have spent years believing myself the sensible sister, the reliable one, precisely because I never received the kind of attention Charlotte and Beatrice received, and I told myself it did not matter to me. When you suddenly received more attention than any of us ever had, I found I was not as immune to jealousy as I believed. Eleanor considered her sister's confession carefully, feeling old resentments of her own, rising alongside a genuine sympathy she had not expected. I understand that feeling better than you might imagine, Margaret. I spent a decade watching all three of you be celebrated while I remained overlooked. I know what it is to resent a sister's good fortune, even when you love her. Then can you forgive me? I can, Eleanor said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it fully. But I would ask that we speak honestly with each other from now on, rather than allowing resentment to fester silently until it causes harm. We have spent too many years as sisters who were polite to each other rather than close to each other. I would like that to change. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and the two sisters embraced properly for what Eleanor realized, with some sadness, was the first time in many years. It was the beginning of a genuine reconciliation between them, one that would deepen considerably in the months that followed, as old resentments were finally spoken aloud and set aside. News soon reached the countryside that Cordelia Vane's deception had become fully public. The forged letters and the specialist's authentication circulated among the very social circles she had once dominated. Society, which had briefly delighted in the scandal implicating Eleanor, turned with equal enthusiasm against the woman who had fabricated it. Cordelia was quietly but firmly excluded from the events and households that had once welcomed her, her reputation in ruins, her ambitions toward the dukedom permanently extinguished. She withdrew from London society entirely within the month, retreating to a distant relative's estate in the north, and was not spoken of again in any circle that mattered to Eleanor. On a clear evening near the end of Eleanor's stay in the countryside, the rain finally having given way to a soft golden sunset, Nathaniel led her out into the estate's small garden, where roses climbed along an old stone wall, and the air carried the scent of rain-freshened earth. I did not plan this as carefully as I should have, he admitted, as they stopped beneath the archway where the roses grew thickest. I had intended some elaborate gesture, some grand display worthy of a duke's proposal. But I find I would rather simply tell you the truth, as we have always told each other the truth. Eleanor felt her breath catch as he took both her hands in his. I do not want a duchess who performs the role for society's benefit, he said. I want a wife who challenges me, who tells me honestly when I am wrong, who does not require an elaborate courtship to know her own worth, because she has always known it, even when the rest of the world failed to see it. I want you, Eleanor Whitmore, not despite the years you spent overlooked, but because those years made you into exactly the woman I did not know I needed until I found her standing quietly at the edge of a ballroom, refusing to look at me. Nathaniel, marry me, he said simply. Not as a duke choosing a duchess, but as a man who has finally found the one person he trusts completely and does not intend to let go of again. Eleanor felt tears gathering, though she was smiling too widely to let them fall. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. There was no audience beneath the rose archway that evening. No watching crowd, no whispering tongue eager for scandal or spectacle. There was only the two of them, and the quiet certainty that whatever had begun in a crowded ballroom months before had grown, through honesty and hardship both, into something neither of them intended to let slip away again. London had never seen a wedding quite like it, and by the morning of the ceremony, the streets surrounding the cathedral were crowded thick with onlookers, eager for a glimpse of the woman who had done what no one believed possible, capturing the heart of England's most guarded duke after a decade of being overlooked by everyone else. Eleanor stood in the small antechamber adjoining the cathedral, her wedding gown catching the early light through a narrow window, and found herself thinking not of the ceremony ahead, nor of the crowds waiting outside, but of the quiet years that had led her here. The ballrooms where she had stood at the edges, invisible. The whispered comparisons to her more celebrated sisters. The particular ache of watching three weddings that were not her own, believing quietly, privately, that a fourth would never come. The door opened, and Beatrice entered first, radiant in her role as one of Eleanor's attendants, followed closely by Charlotte and finally Margaret, whose relationship with Eleanor had transformed so completely in the months since the countryside reconciliation that the two sisters had become nearly inseparable. "You look beautiful," Beatrice said, taking Eleanor's hands. "Truly, Eleanor, I do not think I have ever seen you look so at peace." "I do not think I have ever felt so at peace," Eleanor admitted. Charlotte studied her with an expression that mixed genuine happiness with something more reflective. "Do you remember," she said slowly, "the ball where all of this began? I confess, when the Duke first approached you, I assumed it was some passing curiosity, that he would grow bored within a fortnight." "I assumed the same," Eleanor said. "I am glad we were both wrong." Charlotte reached out to adjust a stray curl near Eleanor's temple, an old, familiar gesture from childhood that Eleanor had nearly forgotten. "You deserve this, Eleanor. You have always deserved to be seen as clearly as we were, and I am ashamed it took so long for the rest of us to understand that." Margaret said nothing at first, simply embracing Eleanor carefully, mindful of the gown, before pulling back with tears already gathering in her eyes. "I am so proud to call you my sister," she said. "Today, and every day since the countryside, I have been proud of that." Eleanor felt her own eyes filling, and Beatrice laughingly insisted they all compose themselves before their mother arrived, and dissolved into tears entirely, ruining the careful arrangements of hair and gown that had taken the better part of the morning to perfect. When the doors finally opened and Eleanor stepped into the cathedral on her father's arm, the sight that greeted her stole whatever composure she had managed to maintain. The cathedral was filled beyond capacity, every seat occupied by members of society, who had once dismissed her entirely, now watching with rapt attention as the overlooked eldest Whitmore daughter walked toward the altar, where the most powerful duke in England waited for her. Nathaniel stood at the front of the cathedral, and Eleanor watched his careful composure soften into something unguarded and entirely genuine the moment their eyes met across the length of the aisle. There was no performance in his expression, none of the careful neutrality she had once observed in ballrooms, only open, unguarded happiness that matched exactly what she felt rising in her own chest. The ceremony proceeded with all the formality expected of a duke's wedding, and yet Eleanor found herself remembering, throughout, small private moments rather than the grandeur surrounding her. The particular way Nathaniel had asked her to dance, insisting despite every reason society might have offered him to choose otherwise. The quiet honesty of their conversations in the garden, in the library, beside the lake at his estate, the rain-soaked arrival at her family's countryside home, proof that his affection had never been about convenience or performance, but about something he had chosen to fight for, even after every reasonable excuse to walk away. When the vows were finally exchanged, Nathaniel's voice carried clearly through the cathedral, steady and certain. "I do not choose you despite the years you spent overlooked, Eleanor. I choose you because of them. Those years made you honest, in a world built on performance, and steady in a world built on flattery. I could not have found a truer partner if I had searched every corner of England for a lifetime." Eleanor's own vows, when she spoke them, carried the same certainty. "I spent a decade believing myself unremarkable, overlooked in favor of others who seemed to shine more brightly. You taught me that being overlooked was never the same as being unworthy, and that the years I spent quietly becoming myself, rather than performing for approval, were the very years that prepared me to become the woman standing before you today." The cathedral erupted into applause as they were pronounced husband and wife, a sound that followed them out into the streets, where crowds had gathered thick enough to slow their carriage's progress toward the wedding breakfast that awaited at Nathaniel's townhouse. The celebration that followed lasted long into the evening, and Eleanor found herself, at one point, standing near a window overlooking the gardens, watching the last of the golden evening light fade over the assembled guests below. Her mother approached quietly, an expression on her face that Eleanor had rarely seen directed her way in all her years growing up. "I owe you an apology," her mother said, without preamble. "I spent years treating you as though your worth depended on a match I did not believe would come. I am ashamed of how little attention I paid you, how easily I dismissed you in favor of your sisters. I hope, in time, you can forgive me for that." Eleanor considered her mother's words carefully, feeling old hurts rise alongside a genuine, hard-won peace. "I forgive you," she said finally. "I understand now that the years I spent overlooked, however painful, shaped me into someone capable of recognizing honesty when I finally found it. I would not trade the woman I became for an easier path that might have led somewhere less true." Her mother embraced her then, and Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in years, to simply accept the affection without questioning whether she had earned it. Later that evening, as the last of the guests began to depart and the townhouse grew quiet, Eleanor found Nathaniel alone in the garden, standing beneath the same archway of roses where he had proposed months before, transplanted carefully from the countryside estate at his request, a small private gesture that only the two of them fully understood. "You brought the roses," Eleanor said, joining him beneath the archway. "I could not imagine beginning our life together without them," he said, drawing her close. "They seemed a fitting reminder of where we truly began, away from the crowds and the scrutiny, in a quiet garden where you finally believed I meant what I said. Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, watching the last light fade over the garden, over the cathedral spires visible in the distance, over a city that had spent a decade overlooking her, and would now, for the rest of her life, know her as the Duchess of Camden. But it was not the title that mattered to her, standing there in the quiet evening air. It was the simple, hard-won certainty that she had finally been seen, not for her fortune or her family's connections or her proximity to more celebrated sisters, but for exactly who she was, patient and honest and quietly resilient, a woman who had waited a decade to be chosen, and had finally been chosen by someone who understood precisely why she was worth the wait. "I love you," Nathaniel said quietly, into the fading light. "I love you," Eleanor answered, and meant it more completely than she had ever meant anything in her life. The overlooked eldest daughter had become, at last, exactly who she was always meant to be, not despite the years spent unseen, but because of everything those years had taught her about the quiet, unshakable value of simply being herself. A year passed, and the Duchess of Camden had become as familiar a figure in London society as her husband once was alone, though Eleanor's presence in any room carried a warmth entirely her own, one that put nervous debutantes at ease, and drew even the most guarded matrons into honest conversation. She had not forgotten the years of being overlooked, and she made a quiet, deliberate practice of noticing the women other hostesses ignored, seating them near her at dinners, drawing them into conversation at balls, offering them the attention she herself had once longed for and rarely received. Margaret had become her closest confidant, the two sisters meeting weekly for tea, their earlier distance replaced by a closeness neither of them had believed possible a year before. Charlotte and Beatrice, too, had grown warmer in their affection, the four sisters gathering regularly in a way their mother often remarked she had never expected to witness, given how distant they had once been. Nathaniel, for his part, had grown into a version of himself Eleanor suspected few in London had ever glimpsed before their marriage, lighter in company, quicker to laugh, visibly more at ease in his own position now that he no longer carried the guarded suspicion that had shadowed him for nearly a decade. He credited Eleanor entirely for the change, though Eleanor insisted, gently, that he had simply allowed himself to become who he had always been, beneath the careful armor of his title. Word occasionally reached them of Cordelia Vane, living quietly and without incident in the north, her ambitions toward society entirely abandoned. Eleanor felt, when she thought of her at all, not triumph but a distant, uncomplicated pity, understanding, better than most, what it was to feel overlooked and desperate for a place to matter. She did not forgive the cruelty of the forged letters, but she found she no longer carried anger toward the woman who had sent them, having built, in the time since, a life secure enough that old wounds no longer required tending. On a quiet evening nearly a year to the day after their wedding, Eleanor found Nathaniel again beneath the rose archway in their garden, the same flowers blooming thick and fragrant in the summer air. She joined him there, resting her hand over his, and told him quietly that their family would soon be growing, news that filled the evening with a joy neither of them attempted to contain. Standing together beneath the roses that had marked every significant turn of their story, from a rain-soaked proposal to a wedding day celebration, to this quiet announcement of a future neither of them could have imagined during those early, uncertain days in a crowded ballroom, Eleanor understood fully, at last, the shape of the life she had built. She had spent a decade being overlooked, quietly waiting at the edges of rooms while the world celebrated everyone but her. And in the end, it was precisely that patient, unassuming steadiness that had drawn the notice of a man who valued honesty over performance, substance over spectacle, and had chosen her, fully and completely, not because society demanded it, but because he had recognized, the moment he first crossed a crowded ballroom to speak with her, that she was worth every risk it took to be truly known. The overlooked eldest daughter had become a duchess, a devoted sister, a beloved wife, and soon, a mother. Her quiet resilience finally rewarded, with a life built not on the fleeting attention of a ballroom, but on the steady, enduring foundation of being genuinely, completely seen.